I'm Jenna Seery, a bookseller and co-host of Poured Over, and today I am thrilled to be joined by Stephen Greenblatt, who you'll know as the Pulitzer and National Book Award winner for The Swerve. You may also remember The Tyrant or Will in the World or any other number of his many works. He's an incredibly decorated author and scholar, and today he is here to talk to me about Dark Renaissance and Christopher Marlowe. So thank you so much for being here today.
It's a great pleasure, Jenna. Thank you.
I remember seeing the cover for this book early on and being so excited because this era of study is so interesting to me. I remember reading Marlowe for the first time in college, reading Dr. Faustus, and just being really blown away by the style of his writing at the time in comparison with Shakespeare and other things I had read from that same time period. So I was so excited to learn more and to put pieces together that I hadn't before. But I'd love to know, to start, how you came to this topic and why you wanted to tell this story.
Well, you may be in a small cohort of people who actually have read Christopher Marlowe, and that's fine with me. That is to say, I I think he was a stupendously great writer and hugely important writer, but he is not largely present in everyone's mind in the way that Shakespeare is from this period. But if we ask ourselves, how did it happen that suddenly there was an explosion at the end of the 16th century in England of writing that basically has shaped our sense of what great literature is, obviously centrally in Shakespeare, but not only in Shakespeare, then actually the answer, at least so I want to suggest, can be traced back to this one rather strange, wonderful, short-lived person, Christopher Marlowe. So part of the reason for actually a long time in my life I've been interested in Marlowe is that, like you, I was struck when I first read him by how stupendous the writing was. This is a truly great poet. And then a poet who made an enormous difference, a playwright who made an enormous difference in the experience of English literature and in our experience of what extraordinary uh, eloquence sounds like in English.
And this was a time, like you said, there was a massive shift happening in, I guess, what we could call the art of England at the time. There was maybe a dearth of material coming out, and then it was also a time when maybe writing, being a playwright, wasn't seen as such a favorable act or such a a great career. So I think it's very interesting that we have this response to when you talk about someone like Shakespeare and we think, oh, that's the most important writer in the English language. But in that time period, it was seen as something different.
Absolutely. Uh, on both counts, you're right. In the 1570s and the decades before, when Marlowe came onto the scene, English culture was dormant, was just about dead. And for very good reasons. There had been a century, basically, of regime changes, religion changes, each of which was accompanied by massive persecution and execution. It was dangerous to stick your head up. You had stood a very good chance of having it chopped off. And people learned fairly quickly that it was safer actually to be mediocre or silent. So that one of the things that fascinated me about Marlowe is that he came onto the scene when everything was basically dead. And the great question is what happens in a culture when things are that way, when basically voices are silenced? What brings them to life again? And the answer in this case is this very strange career of a uh, wildly risk-taking and supremely gifted young man. Doesn't live a long life, but he also, as you've already suggested, decided to do something that was risky in itself for social and economic reasons. That is to say, there's a new industry in town in the 15, starting in 1576, actually, the first public theater built in England since the ancient time of the Romans. And it's the Wild West. People don't know what to expect. It's bringing in a lot of people into the theater, 3,000 people in an afternoon, paying a penny to listen to something. Most of the plays that we have access to that were written early on are unreadable except by the likes of someone like me. That is to say, they're very crude, but they're interesting for scholarly reasons. And then Marlowe made the decision. It was extremely this was not a big career move to be a playwright because the theater was not regarded as a high class entertainment. Public theater, if you wanted to write stage plays in the late 16th century and you wanted to retain your social standing, you wrote what were called closet dramas, written for never to be performed, but for a small number of your friends. Ideally, you'd write them in Latin. Uh, but Marlowe came onto the scene, though he had graduated from university. He was prepared, in effect, to become a minister in the Church of England. Instead, he did this very disreputable thing of writing for the popular stage. And that too made possible the explosion that we now treasure, and especially treasure in the person of Shakespeare.
I was struck as I was reading by, first of all, just how truncated Marlowe's life was, how young he was when he created these works, and how his sort of rise through academia and then into this world of writing was at a time where, I mean, I always knew that there was a limit to education at the time, especially for someone who was, from a poor background, from a working class background. But also, I was struck by just the lack of access to books. You do such a great job of sort of laying out how Marlowe maybe would have read certain things or when he would have had access to these texts. And it was so interesting to me because you don't think about the fact that we have access to books in a way now that is so different from this time period.
Yes, the first thing perhaps to say, Jenna, is that already from the get-go, half the population, namely women, have
Right.
virtually no access
Exactly.
to literacy and to books. So a very small number of women, usually from the most exalted classes, above all Queen Elizabeth herself, have receive a great education and have access to books. But the vast majority have no access to higher education or even to middle ranking education. They might learn, if they're lucky, a little bit about the ABCs, but not much after that. And then the vast majority of the population, we're talking about 90%, who are below the class of gentry, again, are not expected to go, if they're boys, beyond anything but the very preliminary, if that, preliminary schooling. And even that, you have to be able to have to afford a notebook or a slate with a pencil, and not everyone can afford that or have interest in that. So Marlowe comes from a provincial city. Canterbury. It was a great cathedral city, but it had hit upon difficult times. His father was a shoemaker, a cobbler, uh, barely literate. His mother was almost certainly illiterate, as were his siblings. So the first mystery in the case of Christopher Marlowe is how the son of people who come from basically nothing, how he gets to have an education at all. And we don't actually know the answer. I have some speculations in my book as to how it could have happened. He clearly was extremely bright, but the world is full of bright people who don't get an education. And Marlowe somehow managed to uh, get a scholarship to go to the best uh, secondary school, grammar school, as they would have called it then, in Canterbury. And for that, you needed to have good Latin. The classes were conducted in Latin, and how he managed to get there is anybody's guess. I have to say I have my own guess. He did it. And that launched him on a life path that led to greatness and also, in effect, to his early death. But it was an extraordinary act, as as so often, and even now, in the case of people from poor backgrounds, it probably also marked a profound break away from the world of his parents and his siblings, away from the friends he might have grown up with in his extremely poor neighborhood near the slaughterhouses and in Canterbury. And he crossed some bridge that took him to a different place. And the place was one he turned out to embrace, uh, and that affected the writing that he did all his life.
The idea of being in his position and only, being able to finish the level of schooling that he was doing because of this idea of going into the religious world, of, being expected to join the Church of England, and as, as a career, as this only option, and to say, no, never mind, I'm going to go do this instead. And sort of the political implications of perhaps what was going on in his life at the time, and was certainly going around him and with his contemporaries. I think we have, it's just such an interesting world of extremes that they were living in. There was such a polarity in this idea of, I have to survive in this political world where the ideas that he may or may not have had certainly were fatal for those around him.
Yes, he did live in a world of extremes. This is a world in which there was nothing like religious tolerance or tolerance for anything that uh, didn't hold to the orthodox ideas that were being promulgated by the state and the church. England had become a Protestant country in the generation before Marlowe, and it had ruled uh, Catholicism illegal, uh, and it expected everyone to go to church, to the Protestant church, kept track of who was going and who wasn't going. And the authorities were incredibly anxious about this issue, and they weren't being completely paranoid because the uh, Pope in Rome had excommunicated Queen Elizabeth and had, in effect, encouraged the faithful to not simply to disobey her, but ideally to kill her in order to bring Catholicism back in the form of her cousin, Mary, Queen of Scots. And uh, the authorities in the government were fantastically anxious about this and tracking who might be adhering to the old religion. So Marlowe comes into, and a lot of people in that world were. You can't change a religion overnight in a country without lots of people resisting. So Marlowe comes from this very fraught, deeply divided world. In addition, he also comes from a world in which the reason that there are scholarships for poor children to go to grammar school and then go on to university as he did was only really because, again, the Church of England, the Protestant Church, needed more ministers, more priests, and it knew that it couldn't uh, recruit them all from the very small number of upper classes, so that it wanted to expand the base. So that's why Marlowe has access to this extraordinary education that he obviously earned access to by being very clever. But he doesn't seem to have had ever much of a, as far as I can tell, a religious vocation. So he must have said that he was at least going to consider entering the priesthood, but it's not very believable that he ever really fully intended it. I mean, all that would have been available to him in any case for someone of his background was perhaps to have a poor parish in a provincial area, and he had other ideas about himself. So those ideas, in a way, the vocational crisis that he has probably helps to explain one of the strangest and most remarkable pieces of evidence that we have about his life. Most of the evidence that we have about Marlowe's life, apart from the works that survive, are police reports and other government documents. And the most interesting one of them, in many ways, is the one that happened when he had got his BA degree already from Cambridge. He was admitted to Cambridge University, and he went to get his BA from Cambridge. He got it, and then he accepted a further scholarship to get a master's degree. And that was a sure sign that he was going to go on to the priesthood an extra 3 years. And then when he applied to get the degree, the university authorities said no. They denied him his degree, and they explained that he hadn't fulfilled the residence requirement. He was missing for substantial periods of time when he was supposed to be in residence at Cambridge as a student. And then, more menacingly, more ominously, they said that they suspected that he had gone to France, to what was called the English College in France, that was training Jesuits, training Catholic young English Catholics to infiltrate them back into England, to minister to the faithful, and then, in the view of the government, not completely paranoid, possibly to plot against the regime. These are the years building up toward 1588. And as you will know, as most people know, still 1588 is a big year in England because it's the year of the Spanish Armada. The Spanish tried to invade England and put a Catholic back on the throne, kill the Queen, put a Catholic back on the throne. They failed thanks to the weather. But the government knows that this is all building up in the 1580s, and they suspect that Marlowe was part of the university authorities suspect that Marlowe was part of this secret Catholic world of conspirators. And then this strange thing happens, which is that a letter survives, and the letter is sent by the government authorities, the Privy Council, as it was called in London, signed by the most important people in the kingdom, the equivalent of the Secretary of State, the Secretary of Defense, the Secretary of this and that. And it says to the university authorities, give Marlowe his degree. The Queen would be very unhappy that someone who has done the state such service as he has done would not be rewarded with his degree. So you have the remarkable evidence of the most important people in the country standing up for a cobbler's son, a nobody who was at Cambridge as a student, but evidently was doing something. What was he doing? And the obvious thing that he was doing was working for the spy service for a man named Francis Walsingham, who was the head of the Queen's secret service, who had evidently recruited Christopher Marlowe, and he was doing something for them.
I really love this part of Marlowe's story. As I was reading this book, I was like telling other people, it's like, well, just so you know, there's also a spy story in here. So if that,
Yeah.
even if nothing else piques your interest, like I was so intrigued by this world again, in which there is so much unrest. There is this sense that people may not know, they don't trust, those around them. They're not trusting of, especially among these, upper class, where there is a lot of mistrust among each other and accusations. And again, during this time, maybe people being a little quick to react and quick to punish without, there's not a lot of opportunity for always a fair trial. And I imagine that, especially when we come to see what Marlowe writes and the way that he sort of works through some of his political and religious thoughts on stage, the bravery and the choice to do that when it would be much, much easier to sort of write something lovely and pretty and maybe without a little bit of that ideological punch.
It's extremely dangerous to speak your mind if your mind doesn't happen to correspond to the official line of the government. And we have a strange set of circumstances, a strange paradox in Marlowe's life. On the one hand, he seems to have been working for the secret police, as I say. It probably wasn't a very attractive story. We don't know exactly. It would be nice to think that he was simply carrying secret letters back and forth, and maybe that's all he was doing. But the much likelier proposition is that he was keeping track of his fellow students uh, and friends, some of whom were probably uh, Catholic, and reporting to the government. So one would. It's always nice if you're writing a book to think that your hero of the book is a kind of moral saint and perfectly proper and decent. And in fact, uh, I wrote a biography of Shakespeare, and I do think that Shakespeare, on the whole, was a remarkably brave man, but also, uh, I think, a fundamentally moral figure. In the case of Marlowe, one can't be sure that one is dealing with anyone like that. On the contrary, he's a much more disturbing figure because by the evidence that we have, he was involved in very, very disturbing and dirty dealings. At the same time, he's writing things that are quite radically transgressive and risk-taking. Now, it happens that the theater allows that to happen without the government coming down and killing you. And Shakespeare, probably learning it principally from Marlowe, figured out how to do that. I mean, in Shakespeare's King Lear, a character says, "A dog's obeyed in office. A dog's obeyed in office." If you said that in a tavern about the queen or her counselors, you would have your ears cut off or your nose slit. This happened all the time. If you said anything more risk-taking than that, you could have your head cut off. And this happened all the time. But in the theater, the government, the theater is censored. There's an official censor, but the government made a decision, an interesting decision, to allow a kind of escape valve for things that couldn't be said elsewhere. But in the form of the theater, in the form of art, they could be said. And that's often the way in which I think repressive cultures work. It was true in the Soviet Union, at least to some extent. It's true in today's Iran or in China. It's risky. You're near the edge if you're an artist, but you can actually go very close to saying things that would, in other circumstances, basically get you killed. But the theater allows it, and people flock to the theater in England precisely because it's a space of risk-taking and transgression. Marlowe
And that,
created that way of doing things in plays like Tamburlaine, Dr. Faustus, Edward II. He just goes, the Jew of Malta, he goes to the most dangerous places in his culture, and he says things that can't be said elsewhere.
I had never read Tamburlaine until reading about it here, and I was so shocked at, some of those things just don't seem like they possibly could have been on a stage in this time. I mean, there's violence in a way that, you don't expect. There's so many political and moral like quandaries that you just wouldn't expect to see. And I really was like thrown into this world of like imagining being watching something like this when you have, we now have so much access to like violence and, radical thought. But imagine being in an audience and seeing something like this with no reference for anything like it before.
No, you're absolutely right. And in fact, we have access to it almost precisely because of what Marlowe and his contemporaries invented. Marlowe comes onto the scene with a play that celebrates a nobody, a Scythian shepherd from Central Asia, who conquers everybody, kills all the most legitimate rulers of the time, defeats the armies, and then winds up successful, not winds up uh, getting his comeuppance. On the contrary, marrying the woman he is simply seized away from her father. killing thousands of people and so forth and so on. And in effect, the play celebrates him. Uh, and it's the first, in effect, the first mass entertainment. Um, think The Godfather, uh, think The Silence of the Lambs, think spectacular popular entertainments that actually also appeal to a very, very broad segment of the population, both uh, the uh, the overeducated and the undereducated. And that's what Marlowe figured out, and Shakespeare following him figured out how to do. These aren't entertainments written for the very fine elite. And they're also not entertainments written for the underclass. They're written for everybody. They're mass successes. And the we are now, America in a way is the successor, the great successor to this achievement, including its extraordinary violence. The Sopranos and Breaking Bad are in effect the heirs to Tamburlaine and the Jew of Malta.
I love that. I had the closest thing I could come was about 10 years ago. I saw a production of Titus Andronicus at the Globe, standing there, and
Oh,
it's
yeah.
still spectacularly violent, and people were like passing out. And it's just like you get like the energy from the crowd and from the stage. It's incredible.
Absolutely. Yeah. When Titus Andronicus is done, and Titus Andronicus was almost certainly influenced by Marlowe, they usually have to have an ambulance stationed outside the theater to take away the people who have fainted from it.
And I think it's so interesting too in comparison with what else was like popular at the time with the cruelty to animals largely and the cruelty, sort of what was expected in entertainment with like bull baiting and bear baiting. And yet we have the other things you think of like these beautiful odes and poems and li- very close to perhaps some of the Latin counterparts that many would have studied at the time. It goes back into that world of extremes of like the most violent paired with this beautiful language.
Yes, you're right. One of the interesting things about uh, what Marlowe achieves, as opposed to what you could do if you went around the corner to watch someone being executed, which you could in the 1580s, or mutilated on a public scaffold, is that Marlowe figures out how to turn this into art. Now, you could say it's a complicated thing, as Shakespeare too figured out how to do it. It's a complicated thing to turn mutilation into art. But of course, we're the heirs to that. We, as a country, absorb an enormous amount of this strange transformation of the unspeakable into the speakable, and then even into the beautiful. And at the same time, Marlowe, like Shakespeare, is also writing things not simply all about cruelty and violence. Marlowe writes what was in the period the most beautiful love poem, the most beloved love poem of the whole age. Come live with me and be my love, and we will all the pleasures prove. And then he writes a fantastically beautiful poem about the ancient world, about Hero and Leander, and so forth. It's not only about violence and oppression.
And I think that really connects us in this way to his work and connected him to his contemporaries. I think is so interesting to see, like you lay out in the book, how quickly all of a sudden maybe things start to change and the art in England, the culture in England shifts, and you can almost pin it back to this one 20 something guy writing poetry, writing plays. It's so interesting to imagine how quickly that shift can occur.
Yes, partly it's the result of, in a rather familiar way, of money. The theater which Marlowe conquers, in effect, when he's probably 20 years old or 21 years old with Tamburlaine, the theater is a money-making proposition. It's not the way in which art had been largely produced for patronage, for wealthy aristocrats to give you a little bonus for having done it. It has to bring in thousands of people every day. In the case of, because there's no lighting, this is before the creation of artificial light, it's bringing in people during the workday. They have to leave their work and go in the afternoon to the theater. Uh, and it's bringing people of all classes. And Marlowe, it had already begun, but Marlowe and then Shakespeare figure out how to bring thousands of people into the theater. And the more they can figure out how to do it, the more they begin to imitate each other so that it begins to take off quite quickly. Now, Marlowe didn't make money, in fact, from the pennies that people paid to the theater. That wasn't that Shakespeare did, but that wasn't how Marlowe operated. But he wrote plays and was paid for them by the entrepreneurs, what we would now call the producers, who created the theater that we from the Elizabethan period.
It's so interesting too to hear you say, and he wrote this when he was 20, because I have to remember that like by the time he was 29, it's all over, and how quickly at this point that change can be. And I think all the mystery around it and all the things we'll never know about not only how his death came to be, but also what his life would have been had he continued to write, had he continued to exist in this political space. Just sort of the possibility that could have been, would we all be, rather than taking all these Shakespeare classes, would we all have been in Marlowe classes instead?
Yeah, I mean, as he evolves as an artist, he keeps changing. He keeps experimenting with new things. The author who wrote Tamburlaine went on to write the crazy, dark, bloody farce, Jew of Malta, and then the person who wrote the Jew of Malta went on to write the deep, intellectually profound, complex Dr. Faustus, and then the person who wrote Dr. Faustus wrote the sort of gay exploration of Edward II. So he keeps changing, keeps experimenting with new things. So you're right that if he had lived a longer life, who knows what he would have done. What we do know is that the most gifted of his contemporaries, namely Shakespeare, whom he certainly knew and with whom he wrote some things, that Shakespeare was watching each development and thinking about how he could do it. So that the person who wrote, so when Marlowe wrote Tamburlaine, Shakespeare wrote his epic Henry VI plays. When Marlowe wrote The Jew of Malta, Shakespeare wrote The Merchant of Venice, another play about a Jew. When Marlowe wrote Dr. Faustus, Shakespeare couldn't write Dr. Faustus. He hadn't gone to university, but ultimately he wrote Macbeth and The Tempest. And when Marlowe wrote Edward II about the homosexual king, Shakespeare wrote Richard II about a rather comparable figure. So you can watch him. And Shakespeare, to give Shakespeare credit, does everything just as well, in fact, better, so that it isn't simply a case of in Marlowe's early death. But Marlowe is immensely gifted. At the same time, he's skating near the edge his whole life in a way that Shakespeare knew how to survive. Shakespeare, as far as we know, never spent a day in prison. Marlowe was involved in murder, in counterfeiting, in blasphemy, in atheism, in very dark, and then, of course, the spying, so that he's right at the edge for his years. And it's interesting, of course, I explore this in my book, to think about Marlowe's reflecting on what he's doing in his greatest play, Dr. Faustus, someone who makes a deal with the devil, someone who makes a deal with the devil and knows that he has a limited amount of time to live and can do whatever he can within that limited amount of time. That's the play that Marlowe wrote. And I think it's impossible to read that play without thinking about Marlowe's own relationship to his life, to the decisions that he made, including the crucial decision that he made when he was a student of joining the spy service.
And it goes again to this idea that we are lucky to have these works from him at all, because there is just so much lost, I imagine, from those times. There is, we have so few documents about his life, or, letters from him. It's just such a small amount of that firsthand look at his life and his writing. And there's so much mystery in this story.
Yes.
And
No
it,
letters, no manuscripts, no psychiatric records, as it were, no personal documents at all, but a lot of, toward the end of his life, particularly as the noose begins to tighten around him, uh, documents by spies, by double agents, by people watching him, by people reporting or at least claiming to report things that he supposedly was saying, things that you didn't say if you wanted to live a long life. One of the most remarkable documents from the whole period, the whole Elizabethan period that survives, is the report written by someone Marlowe knew well, a very shady character named Richard Baines, uh, listing all of the things supposedly that Marlowe was saying to show that he was a blasphemer, an atheist, a homosexual, a counterfeiter, everything that the period regarded as unacceptable, and saying Baines saying in the report that it would be good for this person's mouth to be stopped, and the Queen should know about it. So,
A lot of dramatic moments that I think would lend to cinema in this. I mean, it is such a cinematic story in a way of this man's meteoric rise and then subsequent fall. It's a story we've seen, I think, a lot often repeated in art.
yes, it is. It's a brilliant, painful, disturbing story, and I say in the acknowledgments of that I've written for my book that one of the germs of what I've written was the conversation that I had now quite a few years ago with a screenwriter, Hollywood screenwriter, who came to see me when I was teaching at Berkeley, and said that he wanted to write a screenplay based on the movie Amadeus. I don't know if you know that movie about Mozart,
Mhm.
uh, but he wanted to write something comparable to that about Shakespeare. And I said to him at the time, "Oh, don't write it about Shakespeare. That life isn't particularly interesting. Write it about Marlowe. That's an unbelievable life, incredible cinematic life." And he laughed and said, "No, it had to be about Shakespeare." I just tried to discourage him, but I failed, and that was a good thing that I failed because he went on to team up with Tom Stoppard and write the screenplay for Shakespeare in Love, which turned out to be a gigantic success. But
Yeah.
I still came away thinking, no, Marlowe's life is the life. That is an unbelievable life story. Painful, tragic, but compelling. And I hope someday, actually, that someone will fulfill that dream and do something with Marlowe's life that is worthy of this extraordinary career he had.
Absolutely. And in reference to all these the variety of sources that play a part in this book, I was hoping we could talk a little bit about sort of your research process and how you go from the idea of a book into creating what you put down on the page.
Sure, I would love to, Jenna. I mean, the uh, in the case of Marlowe, uh, the way has been very generously paved by a long series of scholarly biographers going back to the 1920s and 30s. It was only in the 20th century that crucial documents uh, illustrating Marlowe's life were discovered by scholars, um, including the crucial autopsy record of his murder. And the and after that, there have been an ongoing succession of quite thorough and important biographies in which people have pored over every conceivable document, uh, including such documents as what they call in Cambridge the buttery books. That is to say, the books that record the expenses for beer and food that the students daily were taking in Marlowe's college. So you can actually see whom he was eating with, what days he was there, and so forth and so on. So it's easy enough to start there. But the truth is, and this was my experience also in writing Will in the World, my book about Shakespeare, the truth is that no matter how many people have walked on the path before, you actually have to walk on it yourself. You have to go, as I went, I was a student at Cambridge many years ago uh, myself, but I went back to Cambridge and I went um, to Corpus Christi College, his college. I spoke to the librarian there. I looked at the books that were in the library when he was a student there. I looked at his rooms that we think he lived in. I looked at the Buttery books myself. I went to Canterbury to see the neighborhood in which he grew up, to go to the great cathedral next to which the school he attended still exists, the King's School, it's called now, in Canterbury. I went to track down as much as I could the places that he knew, including Deptford, the place in which he met his end. Of course, everything, this is hundreds of years ago, things are transformed, but actually many things, oddly enough, survive in the form that they would have been in when he was alive. So, for example, Canterbury Cathedral, which was the center of the cult of St. Thomas a Becket, to which 100,000 pilgrims came every year when England was a Catholic country, had been that cathedral had been uh, transformed into a Protestant cathedral in the just before Marlowe's time. And at the center of the cathedral is still, in effect, the empty space that was the space where there was the shrine for Thomas a Becket. So being in the cathedral, seeing that empty space, or the ruined abbey just outside the wall near where Marlowe grew up, these are actually important to try to understand who this person was and what the world was in which he grew up.
I love that. There's so much in this book that just transports you to the moment. I really felt, in a way that I don't always feel reading this kind of history. There is a tactility to the way that it feels like you're put with Marlowe. And I really appreciate that because, again, there's so much in this book that even though I've studied this time or studied Shakespeare, there's things I've never come across before. And I
No,
think
I'm
that's always
glad.
a treat in a book.
I'm glad, Jenna. One of the other places that I went, in fact, and it's related to what you've just said, is I read as many accounts as I could find of foreign visitors to England, because it's, first of all, because I'm a foreign visitor, but also because it is the case that if you go with uh, strangers' eyes, you often see things that actually people living there don't bother to see and record. And that was true of you alluded to before, to those accounts of the bear baiting and the bull baiting, and there are remarkable. England was a country then as now that attracted foreign tourists, including people who went to the theater. And the records of those people, what they saw were those records were extremely useful for my attempting to conjure up what it actually felt like to live there at that time. I still feel, having spent my life thinking about this period and studying it, I still feel the strangeness and wonder of that world, a world that is so much more dangerous and unstable than our world, a world in which life expectancies were terrifyingly low, and in which there's nothing of the kind that we use to, such as anesthesia, to make our life experiences, our unpleasant life experiences, a little less unpleasant, and yet in which people discovered beauty and joy and love. And I still feel the mystery and the wonder of that mix of woe and joy that is so intense in Marlowe, and so intense in Shakespeare, and that can, I think, how shall we say, even after centuries, thrill us and also, in a way, guide us to try to find what we can of joy in our own lives.
I agree. I think that's why we read. That's why artists create art. That's why we gravitate towards these things. It's a sense of community and communion in a way. I mean, I think sometimes when I'm reading something, whether it's fiction, nonfiction, it doesn't matter. But when I can put something of myself into a book and get something back, or to feel that connection to 16th century England, a place I will probably thankfully never be, it's something magical. It's something beyond,
Yeah.
I think, and that's what keeps us going, keeps us moving.
Yes, you're right. It's of course the wonder of art, of great literature. It's what great literature still offers, not only from the 16th century, but from the Iliad, which I see behind you on the screen, from the 8th century before the Common Era. The words, the technology that we invented, that was invented 5,000 years ago in what is now Iraq, that's to say, to be able to write and leave a written record of human life means that you can actually recover the feeling experience, the tactile experience of a world that you'll never know otherwise. And that's magically the case with the great writers, with Shakespeare, with Marlowe, with Cervantes, with Homer, with Jane Austen from the late 18th century. You can enter those worlds, and it's as if for a moment you're their contemporaries. And for those of us whom literature reaches, that's one of the greatest joys of existence.
I agree. And I think for many people, Greenblatt will be that as well with this book about
Oh,
Marlowe.
God help us. Oh, no, but thank you, Jenna.
I have been so grateful to be able to talk to you about this book today and about the life of Christopher Marlowe. So thank you so much for joining me. And I can't wait for people to get Dark Renaissance and to learn
Thank
something
you.
for themselves.
Thank you so much. Such a pleasure. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening. Poured Over is a Barnes & Noble production. To help other readers find us, please rate and review the show wherever you listen to podcasts.